Okay, start to record. Welcome, everybody. I want to start right on time. I know people are going to probably, straggle in here the next couple minutes, but this goes for an hour and a half. So it's from 6 to 7:30. And if some people need to jump out, that's totally fine. I understand. But part of the rationale was, let me sort of explain how this sort of course sort of got going. So recall that in the past, we've had the October speaker series. I think one of the last ones we did is when I did like the military ethics one, because we have the Lent speaker series and we had the October teaching series. And so John and I had talked about having leaders from different faith contexts come in and be the speakers for the October speaker series. And so I thought, well, it might be helpful in sort of preparation for being able to engage with those speakers is to do a little bit of sort of adult formation education prior to that, partly to just either refresh people's memories or introduce some new material that people might not be familiar with respect to Judaism, Orthodox Christianity, and Islam. So you don't feel completely unprepared when a rabbi, an imam, or an Orthodox bishop sort of shows up. So that's kind of the genesis. The problem was with the speaker series being in October and kickoff not being till like the second weekend in September, we have a very compressed amount of time to do any sort of adult formation up to the speaker series. So that's why these are an hour and a half instead of just an hour, because there was no way I could do any justice to any of these three in just an hour. And so hopefully it won't be too rushed and that maybe we'll have some time at the end for some discussion and so forth. So that's kind of the rationale and the genesis for sort of how this course got put together, why we're doing it, and why it's structured the way it is. So, okay, so here's the series schedule. So today, Wednesday, September 15th, we're doing Judaism via Zoom. And then next Wednesday, we'll do Orthodox Christianity, also via Zoom. And then the third week, we'll do Islam, also via Zoom. We're not exactly mirroring the order of speakers based on the introductions, based on the speaker schedules, but the first speaker will be Rabbi Looper, who's the rabbi here at Temple Beth Or in Montgomery. Then the second speaker is Imam Mikel Sabri, who is an assistant imam at the Montgomery Islamic Center. And he's also a licensed therapist too. He's kind of a bivocational person, kind of like I was in the past. And then the third speaker is going to be Bishop Sebastian, who is basically the assistant bishop to the Orthodox bishop of kind of the big Atlanta diocese. It covers multiple states. But I just found out an hour and a half ago that he can't come on the 20th because he has a conflict. So we've been exchanging texts and emails, and he can come the following week on Tuesday, the 26th. So that is going to be when he comes. So everything's on Wednesday, except the 20th got canceled because the bishop couldn't come, but he can come Tuesday, the 26th. So that's kind of the schedule as for now, but stand by for updates. But the main things are the classes are on Zoom, and then come to the parish in October for the in-person. We're tentatively planning on having dinners prior to the speakers. However, given sort of the dynamics of COVID, we're playing all that by ear. But at the very minimum, even if we don't do dinner, they will be in the parish hall in person offering their lecture. So the same time blocks are the same from 6 to 7:30 for all the events. But I'll kind of review that as we go along each week. Okay. So what's the point here? So part of it is we live in a religiously plural society here in America. And most of us at St. John's have mostly grown up either Christian or some version of Christian. And we're not as familiar with the other Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, or Islam. And most of us in sort of Anglican and Protestant Christianity, or people who have been Catholic and became Episcopalians, don't know much about Orthodox Christianity, which, arguably still practices probably the most ancient form of Christianity since the early church that's been carried throughout history. And we'll talk about that next week, about why that is and some of the differences between Orthodox Christianity and Western Christianity. So part of it's just a very basic, how do we be sort of intelligent, thoughtful, broad-minded, citizens in the United States to be able to work and understand people of different faith backgrounds in our own community. So that's kind of the overarching goal. And part of it is it's twofold. One, so kind of just the adult formation that I'm doing, which are very cursory and very basic introductions to these faiths. But to actually talk to leaders from these faith traditions and talk to them about their experience of being in a non-majority faith tradition in the United States. So even though Christianity is still like the major Christian sort of tradition, the Orthodox are very much a minority position, because it's mostly Protestant Christianity is the predominant form of Christianity in the US. And Judaism has always been a minority religion, and Islam even more so. So I thought it would be helpful to actually have leaders come in so you could talk to them and ask them questions about what is it like, leading your congregations as religious minorities in a country, and what are some of the challenges that they face exercising and practicing and being Jewish and Orthodox and Muslim in the 21st century. Because a lot of the challenges they face, we also face, because part of it is being, just being religious in the 21st century has a common set of problems. But I think each of the faith traditions have their own particular challenges. So that's why I thought, okay, let's have people come in that you can actually talk to. Now, ideally, I don't know if we'll be able to actually work this out, but we'd like to invite some members of the other congregations to come to the in-person discussion in October. Now, I don't know if the other congregations are going to want to come, or if so, how many, but the invitation will be extended. So with respect to the Jewish speaker, would members of Temple Beth or join us for dinner if we have it, or at least for dialogue? So we have joint congregations in that conversation. And would members from the Greek Orthodox Church in Montgomery come? And would some members of the Muslim community come and be with us? So that's sort of the aspiration. It may not work out in practice, but at least we'll have St. John's parishioners there with these faith leaders. So that's kind of the overarching goal and motivation, and kind of what we're trying to accomplish with this particular series. All right. So today is Judaism. Again, it'll be about an hour and a half. And just full disclosure, I am not an expert in Judaism. I learn about it every time I preach, because trying to faithfully explicate scripture requires more familiarity with the Jewish tradition, because it's really the forerunner to Christianity. So I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. I did teach comparative world religions when I was a professor at the Air Force Academy, but that was over 10 years ago, and I don't remember that much, even though I went back and looked through some of my notes. So what I'm going to do is kind of set the structure of tonight's talk, and with some of the basic building blocks and areas to cover. But I'm going to lean heavily on some very short, kind of fun instructional videos that got produced by this company. It's called Judaism 101, I think. And they have these short, like 3 to 4 minute video clips on a whole bunch of different subjects, which are fun and very informative and can do way more justice to the subject matter than can be done by you just listening to me talk for an hour and a half. So the class structure today will be sort of, I'm going to introduce some topics, share a little bit about it, and then we'll sort of watch a video, and then sort of move on, and then maybe have some discussions, short discussions or reflections on the videos, perhaps as we're going through. So what do I want to sort of talk about tonight is first kind of start off and just sort of talk about Jewish law and interpretations. And talking to Rabbi Looper, I was like, well, how do you sort of understand Judaism, or sort of what's your approach to sort of teaching it? And he says, I think Judaism is really a religion of interpretation. And you'll see that, I think, as we go through the course and we look at some of the different videos about why there's such a variability in Judaism, right? And even when we look, in the New Testament, we talk about the Pharisees and the chief priests and the scribes, right? And there's always these disputes about the law. And we know there's already different sort of sects in Judaism during the New Testament, right? We have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. So, I think sometimes when we think of other world religions or other faith traditions, because we're not as familiar with them, we just think of them as, as a sort of homogenous, monolithic sort of thing. Like if you ask somebody not familiar with Christianity and they'd say, okay, we'll describe a Christian, they'd come up with some probably very basic facts, maybe some stereotypes. And they would think, well, all denominations of Christianity are like this and all Christians are like that, right? But I think there's did I read somewhere there's over 20,000 different denominations of Christianity now? It's like something absurd. So we know Christianity comes in a variety of practices and worship styles and beliefs and commitments and all that. And so, no other world religion is immune to that either. And so we'll see that in Judaism through this as well. And also what I want us to talk about a little bit is sort of, basic things that we associate with Judaism, like keeping kosher, the Friday night Shabbat dinner, and then introduce you to the Jewish calendar. And just so you can kind of see how, we have our liturgical calendar that goes from Advent, right, to Christmas and Epiphany, and then Lent and Easter, Pentecost, right? We've got this cycle. And the Jewish tradition also has its own, sort of, if you will, liturgical cycle, but it's based on different sets of things. And then even be able to look at that, you can kind of see some of the parallels and overlaps with the Christian liturgical year as well. Maybe that's not exactly, it doesn't match up, year to year, but you can see where there's some parallels and crossover. But that'll be sort of a kind of a quick hit, and just kind of a surface level thing. And then towards the end, there's a good couple videos that sort of talk about how, we'll call it, modern Judaism has developed. And when I mean modern Judaism, and when most people mean modern Judaism, that's like the 18th century forward. So it's basically when modernity began with the Enlightenment and so forth. So modern Judaism, I don't mean 21st century Judaism, but modern Judaism. And that's basically around the 18th and 19th century is when the major denominations of Judaism came into being. So in the Christian tradition, the schism between Eastern and Western happened in 1054. So that was kind of our first denominational split. And then you had the Reformation, which branched off from the Catholic Church. And then you've got Anglicanism and then Calvinism, right? So in the Christian tradition, that was all happening in the 16th, 15th centuries with the Reformation. But up until about the 18th century, Judaism was just mostly known as traditional Judaism until modernity happened. And then you've got Reform and conservative and ultra Orthodox. And so those are all relatively recent divisions within the within the Jewish tradition. So I think it's important to sort of understand that and why we see different expressions of Judaism, and also how the expressions of Judaism fall similar lines. There's denominations of Judaism that are very progressive, And there's some that are more conservative and then some that are really traditional. And then what they're conservative or traditional over varies based on the denomination. So whether that makes people feel better or worse, I don't know. But the phenomenon of what were more homogenous or religious tradition that was a little bit more unified, how it got fragmented and what the causes were. And that phenomenon affected really, a lot of religious tradition. So that's sort of the end. And if we have time, it might be helpful, maybe if we talk about it as a group, some questions we want to ask the rabbi, because he asked me, he said, what do you want me to talk about? And I said, well, whatever you want. I said, they'll probably be most interested in hearing maybe your own faith story, some challenges you face as a rabbi leading your congregation, and maybe what it's like to be Jewish in America, what it's like to be Jewish in Montgomery. So it's really up to him. But he asked me, he said, well, can you have the class maybe think about questions ahead of time, and then maybe give me those questions, and then I'll think about those questions and try to work them into my presentation. So what I'm going to ask you to do through the, if you have pencil and paper at hand, or if you're thinking about it, maybe as we're going through some of the information, to write down some questions that you have, or email them to me later so that I can send them to him. All right. Any questions before I move on? Nope. Okay. So first of all, when we say, okay, who is a Jew? That's a complicated question in some ways with respect to other faith traditions. Because somebody who identifies as a Jew could be someone who ascribes to the doctrine, if you will, or particular beliefs or ways of interpreting. It's probably better to say ways of interpreting the Torah and the law. There's some people who really maybe don't feel connected with the law or doing Jewish practices, but identify as Jewish because that's their ethnic heritage. Right? Because being Jewish is, for many people, is viewed as something that's inherited, right? It's hereditary. You're born into a Jewish family, therefore you are Jewish. And we don't look at being Christian necessarily that way. Even though we're maybe born into a Christian family, we don't really think of kind of inheriting being Christian in the same way that being a Jew is really linked strongly to kinship ties and family. And that's what, circumcision and all that's about. And then there's sort of cultural Jews or secular Jews. And so maybe we think about that kind of like people who might call themselves cultural Christians, right? Where maybe they don't go to services, maybe they just go to Christmas and Easter, or they might identify as Christians, but they don't really practice Christianity, but for whatever reason, that's an identity they take on, right? There could be some Jews who never go to synagogue, but they keep kosher because that's part of their identity. So anyway, it's even to ask like, who is a Jew or what is a Jew is a very complicated question within this tradition. But even given that, the one unifying feature for anybody who claims to be a Jew is the belief in one God who works through history and who has chosen the Jewish people. So the Jews being God's chosen people. And we're familiar with that as Christians, right? About Yahweh rescuing the Jews out of slavery from Egypt, the Israelites, right? Moses delivering them, giving them the 10 Commandments, forming them to a nation, being their God in the midst of all these other pagan and foreign empires, having covenants with them, etc. So regardless of whether people are Reformed, conservative, Orthodox, traditional, ultra-Orthodox, that would be one common thread, that they believe in one God who works through history and has chosen the Jewish people. But like how that gets worked out is variable depending on which Jewish tradition people adhere to. So this is where we get a lot of the division about the state of Israel. Should it be a state or not a state, or sort of Zionist Jews, or so that's also worked into aspects of what's the goal and destiny of the chosen Jewish people. So that gets worked out politically too. And I think one of the videos talks about that a little bit. So maybe we get to that at the end. All right, let's go. All right, so I want to kind of start us off with, if we talk about Judaism as a religion of interpretation of the law, and one of the defining features of Jews and of the early Israelites was that God gave Moses the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. So the giving of the law to the people was the constitutive action, if you will, of God making this covenant with Israel and forming them into a nation. Sort of the precursor to that was rescuing them from the Egyptians through Moses, etc. But the defining feature is the giving of the law. And so the 10 Commandments are only 10, right? But there's bunches of laws written in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and all throughout the Hebrew scriptures. And so a lot of how Jews would understand themselves as sort of keepers of the law, or men and women of the law. And so the word mitzvah just means command. I think mitzvot, I believe, is plural. And so much of Jewish identity, habits and practices, sort of worship, ethics, cultural norms, social practices, meals, kosher, all that's contained within the law and interpretations of the law. So I'm going to show you this first video that sort of talks about this conceptually, and then how individual Jews sort of understand it and how it can be experienced in a plurality of ways.
In Judaism, it's not enough to just hold a belief. What's important is what you do. It's an action-oriented religion, and the individual actions are called mitzvahs, or in Hebrew, mitzvot. One mitzvah, for instance, is observing the Sabbath. Another is keeping kosher. They mainly involve rituals, ethics, and relations between people and with God. While mitzvah is often translated as good deed, it literally translates as a commandment. You've probably heard of bar and bat mitzvahs. That just means son or daughter of the commandment. When children become adults in the Jewish tradition, they are now responsible for keeping the mitzvot. Many of the mitzvot are based on common sense ethics, like don't murder, while others don't seem to make sense, like the mitzvah not to combine wool and linen. And some are incredibly unique to Judaism, like the Passover Seder. The rabbis counted 613 mitzvot in the Torah, called mitzvot deoraita, from honoring parents to not taking revenge. And they created further rabbinic commandments, mitzvot derabanan, from lighting Shabbat candles to public Torah readings. Not even the holiest rollers can do every mitzvah. Some are obsolete, like stoning, while others are not actually possible, like anything involving the temple, which was destroyed 2,000 years ago. Still, mitzvot give people guidance for how to live in the world, and some Jews take that guidance extremely seriously. There is a huge spectrum of ways that people observe mitzvot. Some make their own decisions. Others follow a denominational position or ask a rabbi. With kosher, it's a mitzvah not to combine milk and meat. Some take that to mean no cheeseburgers, while others wait 6 hours between eating a burger and eating cheese. So why does anyone take on mitzvot? One answer is for the same reason kids follow their parents' rules. They trust the source, even if they don't necessarily understand all of the rules. There's a because I said so feeling that comes up sometimes in learning about mitzvot, particularly the ones that seem nonsensical. Another way to think of it is as a practice, like yoga or playing the piano. While you might not feel like practicing every day, over time, the commitment gets easier. And with discipline, you get stronger, faster, in the zone. The idea is that the practice of following the mitzvot makes you better at connecting to the holy. Committing isn't easy, but the more you commit, the more you get out of it. For instance, keeping Shabbat sets the day apart, and over time, creates a holy space every week. We are all obligated to someone or something. Kids, work responsibilities, taxes. Mitzvot are an obligation to something larger. community and God. To learn about the origin of these Jewish laws, watch the next video in the Judaism 101 series and click.
All right. Everybody still there? Hopefully. It's hard on this end without being able to see anybody. All right. So big overview. I thought the point about sort of bar and the bat mitzvah is about being a man or a woman of the law, which happens when you're 13. And it was interesting. I was watching a video and kind of prepped for this, and one of the rabbis was talking about kind of the irony about, and I think as Christians do this too. He's like, so much of education is focused on young people, like primary education, like religious education, sort of Sunday school, etc. But he's like, really, it's like Judaism is really for adults, because it's really only when you become of age, when you have sense of responsibility, and adult, it's 13, right, in Judaism, that you can really take on an expression of being a Jew and participating in the life of the community, having, some sort of responsibility and role in the community, being able to start interpreting and ask questions about the law, holding yourself accountable, and so forth. So he was kind of lamenting about, even in Judaism, how after people have their bat mitzvah, that kind of education for teenagers and so forth kind of drops off. So I thought that was sort of an interesting shared challenge. Okay, so let's talk about the scripture in which the laws come from. And I've done classes on this before, so I don't want to sort of rehash this. We tend to call the Old Testament, the Old Testament and then the New Testament. Jews are going to call it the Tanakh, which is basically an acronym for the first initials of the three divisions of the Hebrew scriptures. So the Torah is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The Nevi'im are the prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc. And the writings, you're going to get Kings, Chronicles, etc. So, but that's not, yes, the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures or the Tanakh is a lot longer than the New Testament, but there's a lot of stuff in there. And so there's another group of writings called the Mishnah, which is also considered law. Some call it like oral Torah, which is the interpretation of the law. So you have all the 613 commandments, but thou shalt not murder. Okay, well, what does that mean? What does murder mean? What if people die accidentally, right? So, all the lawyers in the audience kind of understand about case law. How do you apply it? What's the context? What are the exceptions? How do you explain nuanced cases and so forth? And so that's what the Mishnah was. It sort of developed. And it basically interprets the 613 laws in these 6 categories. So laws on agriculture and prayer, holy days, and even the writing and the copying of scripture, laws concerning marriage, civil and criminal actions, prohibitions on idolatry, ritual cleanliness, and sacrifices of the temple. So those are kind of the main categories of attention that the mitzvot in the Tanakh are going to be organized, and that's what the rabbis are working to interpret and have discussions over. And as you can imagine, different rabbis might have different interpretations because they probably have, in some ways, have different contexts, different experiences, etc. So, for example, why the Mishnah is kind of sort of more specific. So the law of Moses would say all yeasts have to be removed from a house prior to Passover. So the Mishnah is now going to sort of interrogate the law to find out some of the specifics. So when can we be sure all yeasts have been removed? Do you have to move it by an hour or 6 hours or a day or 3 days? And then, well, what about cosmetics that contain yeast? So this would be a more contemporary question, right? So are there other things in other products that maybe aren't related to food that have yeast or yeast byproducts in it? And do those also have to be removed from the house? And if so, why? And if yes, then by when? And then what do you do if you're not certain? So we all know that we can have sort of a general law, but then when it actually comes to applying that law in daily life with all the myriad sort of circumstances and consequences, there's lots of questions. We're not sure what to do. So the Mishnah basically became sort of a written law code, sort of that accumulated over time of different rabbis' interpretations of these particular laws. So you can go through, and as sort of the Mishnah and the Talmud, we're going to talk about the Talmud later, you can see different rabbis throughout history commenting on the interpretation of that particular law over like 2,000 years time in some ways, right? So it's kind of the most expansive maybe view of case law maybe that still exists. Okay, so now there's this thing called the Gemara. So we've got the real short laws in the Torah, and then you have Mishnah that's asking these very sort of critical questions. And then the Gemara is actually going to tell long stories about how the law is particularly interpreted. And it's long, 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 and very long. So here's sort of an example of how these things are in, like, I want to say, in depth. So you might have a Torah passage in this shorter discussion from the Mishnah. So let's say you have 2 to 3 verses in the Torah, then you'll have 5 pages of Mishnah. But the Talmud, which is the Mishnah plus the Gemara, might be 300 pages, right? So you might have 300 pages of interpretation on 2 to 3 verses of the Torah. And that's just all the stuff that's been written down. And then as you'll see in a minute in this next video, what do people do about it sort of today? How do they get their questions answered?
Judaism is pretty focused on what you do from day to day, not just when and how to pray, but how to eat, raise kids, farm, cut your fingernails. If you want to learn how to live in a Jewish way, you can watch all our videos, but eventually you're going to want to dive into Jewish law or halakha. Some people say halacha, some people say halakha, which means the path or the way. Here's an overview. It starts with the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible includes the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. For short, you can call the Hebrew Bible Tanakh, which stands for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. If you're Jewish, saying Tanakh beats the pants off saying Old Testament, which is a Christian term used in contrast to the New Testament. When the Hebrew Bible was being codified, there was debate over which books to include in the canon. And there's a whole list of books called the Apocrypha that didn't quite make the cut. Some of these books are actually in the Christian Bible, the Book of Maccabees, for instance. And there's other books called the Pseudepigrapha that didn't make it into anyone's Bible. Inside the Hebrew Bible, there are lots of laws and stories that later generations weren't sure how to interpret. For example, the Torah says not to work on the Sabbath. But what does that mean? What's work? Does it apply to office jobs or just manual labor? Does it include working out? So along come 6 relatively short books called the Mishnah, which try to explain it in a style that's pretty straightforward and sparse. The Mishnah gives a list of 39 things not to do on Shabbat, like baking, sewing, building, etc. It doesn't really explain why those 39 activities are forbidden, it just gives the list. And then, just as the Mishnah tries to explain the Torah, there's another set of books that attempt to explain the Mishnah. This is called the Gemara, and it's massive. 63 tractates or sections. The Gemara elaborates on the Mishnah by going into a long conversation. So the Mishnah says simply, you can't thresh on Shabbat. Great, no problem, you say. But the rabbis in the Gemara took on, what does that mean for us today? And they extrapolated, well, you can't just avoid threshing grain. The act of removing a seed kernel from its tough outer layer is a lot like shucking corn. So let's not do that either. You also can't wring out a washcloth or squeeze lemon into your tea. Extrapolation. Together, the Mishnah and Gemara are called the Talmud. There are 2 Talmuds, the Babylonian, or the Bavli, and the Jerusalem edition, or the Yerushalmi. Same basic idea, but they were put together in 2 different locations, so they have some really interesting variations. The Talmud is so large that yet another set of texts came along to simplify and codify it, the Mishnah Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. And yet, if you spent years making your way through all those texts, you still wouldn't know everything Jewish, like, say, whether escalators are allowed on Shabbat. So along comes modern Jewish case law. People send questions about specific situations to an expert and receive written answers called responsa. You can look up responsa online, and they cover everything from immunization to gambling to escalators. The written Torah is considered sacred, obviously, and Jews view all the texts that came after as sacred also. They are known as oral Torah. Jewish law is not frozen in time. It's continuing to unfold today. Local communities are empowered to study and interpret halakha. This varies a lot in different branches of Judaism today. In some communities, all the texts that we've discussed are considered binding. And if there's a question about them, you go to your local rabbi whose decisions are binding. In other communities, people are individually free to study and make their own decisions about halakha. These really different approaches to understanding and observing Jewish law are one of the main differences behind different Jewish movements. For more about the various Jewish movements, watch the next video in the Judaism 101 series.
All right, hopefully that's helpful. If you think about why there's a lot of discussion about the law in the New Testament, right? And why the scribes and the Pharisees and the chief priests are constantly challenging Jesus about why he's doing certain things, right? Why are you eating with tax collectors and sinners? Why are you, consorting with this woman? Why did your disciples not wash their hands, etc.? And this has to do with the way one follows the law, and one's obedience to the law and expression of it is central to Jewish identity. So Jesus was raised a Jew and taught in the synagogues and wasn't claiming to be anything other than that. He's, the Messiah. But this is why the discussions about the law come up all the time, right? And also why it's interesting when Jesus says, I have not come to abolish the law, but I've come to fulfill it as well. So this tension between obedience to the law and having the law in this very broad sense. So I hope that's what you're getting from this, right? When Jews talk about the law, or when the law is talked about in the New Testament even, it's referring to this, not only the 10 Commandments, but the 613 plus the interpretations of that as it had developed in Judaism up until the time of Jesus. So it's a very broad category and concept. And the progressiveness or the conservativeness of even the sects in Judaism, like the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes, it also has to do with how they're interpreting the law. So the Pharisees, who we tend to think is, these really conservative folks who kind of are against Jesus, are the most liberal of the sects in Judaism, right? So that's kind of the first main thing that, I kind of want you to have a sense of when we're talking about Judaism. So when we're talking about the law, it's this really big thing. It's not only just the verses in the Torah, it's also the commentary on it on the Mishnah, and then how that got expanded into the Gemara, and then how it's an ongoing dynamic thing, right? So these questions about, if you can't work on the Sabbath, well, what is work? That's a great question. And what work has changed, and a lot about the last 2,000 years. So of course, you'd have to have an ongoing discussion and interpretation of the law. And so you can see why different, denominations in Judaism might argue, just like we argue over certain things about, do we want a more strict version of what work is? Do we want a more permissive or flexible version of work? And that's going to depend on the context, who the rabbis are, interpretation, and so. Okay, so want to sort of just do this quick video here on what's kosher, and followed by another short video on Shabbat and sort of the Friday night sacred meal. And these sort of go together because I think if people know anything about Judaism, they say, oh, there's this kosher and there's dietary restrictions and sort of food laws and so forth. But I think as Christians, we again tend to think, well, everybody does it the same. and everybody practices kosher the same way, and that's not true. So watch this sort of video on sort of what kosher is.
Before getting into what is kosher, the bigger question is, why do people keep it? And there's no one answer. For some, it's simply, I'm an observant Jew, God commanded it in the Torah, so I do it. For others, it's, I grew up keeping kosher and it's what I'm used to, what I'm comfortable with. It just feels Jewish. Or what you consume matters and eating should be a mindful experience. It makes the spiritual physical. Or even it makes me part of something bigger, my Jewish community. When bringing food into the home of someone who keeps kosher, it's important to be respectful of their food restrictions. It's best to stick with fresh fruits or vegetables or packaged foods that have kosher symbols on them. More on this later. So what are the rules of kosher? There are 3 basic rules. You can't eat some animals. The animals you do eat need to be slaughtered in a special way, and you can't combine milk and meat. Let's break that down. What animals can't be eaten? Famously, of course, pork and shrimp and shellfish, but the Torah has a long list of animals, calling some of them clean and some of them unclean. You are what you eat. Pigs, they're out, cows, they're in, chickens, ducks, turkey, salmon, tuna, also in. Next, what is kosher slaughter? Well, it's called shlita, and there are lots of rules on how different animals need to be butchered and prepared, which we're going to see. What's important to know is that because meat needs to be prepared in a special way, there's a labeling system. Certifying agencies, famously the OU, put their labels, their hechshers on foods. If there's a hechsher on it, the meat or any packaged food is certified kosher. Not, it isn't. Some foods don't require hechshers, like fruits and veggies and others. Most food in a grocery store is not kosher. You may have to hunt around a bit for some products, or even go to a separate store to find things like kosher meat and wine. Finally, not combining milk and meat. Yes, this does mean no cheeseburgers, but it goes a bit beyond that. For instance, you can't use butter and mashed potatoes you're serving with turkey. Separating milk and meat is taken so seriously that some people wait an hour or 3 or even 6 between eating the two. In kashrut, food gets lumped into 2 main categories, milk and meat. If you're invited to a kosher meal, it will either be a milk meal or a meat meal, a meal that has dairy or one that has meat, not both. This is why kosher restaurants are either dairy restaurants or meat restaurants. Kosher kitchens at home generally have 2 sets of everything, dishes, pans, and sometimes, yes, even the kitchen sink. Food that's neither milk nor meat is called parg. You can have that food with everything. Yay. These rules for kosher originally came from the Torah, which is sparse about the specifics. All the Torah says about milk and meat, for instance, is you shall not boil a kid in the milk of its mother, which some believe was in response to an ancient pagan ritual where they did that. Like most Jewish commandments, mitzvot, the rest of the rules of kosher come from thousands of years of tradition, where people asked, what's the deeper meaning of this passage? So the 3 basic kosher laws got extrapolated and evolved into the consensus Jews have today. That, by the way, is still evolving. For instance, one of the debates right now is whether to include ethical labor practices inside the kosher conversation. Kosher standards vary by community. They look different in a Tel Aviv hotel and your grandma's kitchen, but the main motivation, making conscious holy choices every day, remains the same. And these shared kosher standards help to bring communities closer through everything from potlucks to shiva calls to Shabbat dinners. If you're exploring Judaism, it's worth trying kosher out. Maybe try it on for a week and see how it feels. Your best bet is hanging out with a friend or a Jewish teacher who keeps kosher and have some fun cooking parties. There's a bit of a learning curve, and if you didn't grow up with it, you're going to want more than a YouTube video. This is part of the Judaism 101 series. Click here to see the next video on Shabbat, and here if you want.
All right. So I remember when I saw that, I thought it was interesting that toward the end he mentioned now a discussion about fair labor practices, and are brought into sort of brought into the category of sort of what is kosher. So it's kind of evolving beyond just, you know, the milk and meat separation or what you can eat and not eat on, you know, what days. All right. Let's see. Okay, so one of the main sort of features of Jewish identity, if anything is practiced in many Jewish homes, it's going to be the Shabbat meal on Friday nights. And maybe some of you have had the opportunity to go over to someone's house who's Jewish and share this meal with them. I think I've only done it once, and I think that was, gosh, it almost been like 30 years ago. So it's been a while. But if some of you have done this before, that's great. So it'll sort of give you sort of maybe remember what your experience of that was like.
So maybe you're Jewish and wondering how to get started doing this Shabbat thing. Or maybe you're not Jewish and you want to better appreciate what your friend is up to or why your coworker leaves early on Fridays. Let's look at two things: why people do Shabbat and how. Okay, so why? It's the single most important building block of living a Jewish life, according to pretty much everyone. The Torah explains in chapter 1 that God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day ceased from creating. So to mark that and appreciate creation, Jews cease creating things as well. We live life in the realm of space, going places, making things, buying and fixing stuff. We have to focus on the physical world on a day-to-day basis, and sure, we can do it mindfully. But Shabbat is a maneuver into the world of time. Letting go of making and buying and fixing is entering what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel famously called a palace in time. It's hard to set aside the phone, the email, the cleaning, the errands, but that's the whole point, to set aside the time for something holy. It not only connects you to God, but also to yourself and the whole of the Jewish people. It creates a rhythm to life with the 7th note of rest time. Now, the how. People talk about Shabbat being a day of not working or a day of rest. Jewish tradition actually defines 39 categories of creating-ish work: planting, building, hoisting stuff around, that you're supposed to refrain from on Shabbat. And traditionally observant Jews extrapolate from that to mean no emails, no errands, no driving, cooking, or using technology. It's more than what's not done. Making Shabbat, or as you might hear it said, keeping Shabbos, means making sacred time. People bring in Shabbat by lighting candles at sundown and go from a dinner with challah and wine and singing to a morning maybe spent at services hearing about the Torah portion, to a big lunch with friends or a picnic in the park. There are naps, strolls around the neighborhood, books, text study, games, lots of low-key pastimes. It ends at nightfall on Saturday with a candle putting out ritual called Havdalah. There are tons of ways to celebrate Shabbat. And if you want to know more specifics about challah, candles, or songs, or how to say some of the blessings, we have plenty of resources for you. Heschel said that things do not lend significance to a moment. It is the moment that lends significance to things. Taking a day to live this way can bring a sense of wholeness, or in Hebrew, shalom. So let's end with a wish for Shabbat Shalom.
All right. I don't know about some of you guys, but doesn't that seem great? Just to set aside 24 hours with no email, no telephones, no driving. Might be hard with electricity. But anyway, I think there's something about the importance of that practice of making sacred time and just taking that time out once a week, right? This practice to sort of focus on God and the family life and remembering the history of Israel and one's faith, and just kind of taking time to slow down and be and being more in time than sort of being preoccupied with work all the time, right? And so as Christians, right, we used to maybe do this on Sundays, right? We even had laws, blue laws that kind of boxed out time, so we didn't have to worry about soccer on Sundays and restaurants being open and all these sorts of things. But as those laws got relaxed and sort of secular culture and capitalism basically sort of became the dominant sort of framework in which we live, it's a lot harder for us to create that sort of sacred time. And so, I think as Christians, we've kind of lost this, but it is still a major feature in sort of Jewish identity. It'd be interesting to maybe ask the rabbi sort of what they do on Shabbat and what are the practices for their family, and then maybe hear about how different families approach it, and then what is it like realistically trying to do this on a regular basis in the context of 21st century America. And so how do families who are able to keep this, what kind of decisions do they make in order to incorporate this as a major part of their spiritual practices and their family life? So, okay, I'm not going to dwell too much on kind of the Jewish calendar. I don't expect you to absorb this calendar because there's a lot of stuff on it. But I do just want to point your attention to kind of how this is structured. So if you look in the very center, that's sort of our regular Julian calendar, January through December. In the middle, in the bullseye. And then around the outside are sort of the Jewish months, calendar months 1 through 12. And notice sort of Nisan kind of happens in the spring, and it's connected to Passover, which makes sense, right? Because Passover in some ways is kind of one of the first features of the story of Israel. And then sort of it goes around. And the next slides, I'll just sort of talk to you about a little bit about the major pilgrimage feasts and the high holy days. But what's really interesting is you look how the calendar is very much set around an agricultural sort of season. So you've got the hot season and the mild winter and vine tending and harvesting and all that. So you get this sense of the seasons of the year and the harvest, which drive the sense of time. So in the Christian tradition, our sense of time is driven more by the life of Jesus and his ministry, right? From preparing for the Feast of the Nativity and Advent and then Christmas. And then most of our liturgical year follows from kind of the birth of Jesus and the preparation through the life of Jesus to Pentecost and then the church, and then we start over again. So ours is more the life of Jesus, where this is much more grounded in the cycles of the seasons and harvest and farming, which makes sense. And then there are their feast days. If you look around the very outer circles, you've got Purim and Passover, Feast of Weeks and Pentecost, the New Year, Yom Kippur, Feast of Booths, etc. Those are on the outer circle. And their sort of major feast days are not necessarily disconnected from sort of the harvest cycle, but their feast days are also located and coincide with major events in the history of Israel and their understanding as a nation as well. So it's God's action in history and very sort of defining features that kind of drive many of their high holy days and major festival days, but it's also not disconnected from the harvest cycle and so forth. All right, so I think when we think about sort of Jewish holy days and their major festivals, there's two main aspects to think about it. So the first are the pilgrimage festivals, and these are really the main festivals for the Jewish community. And then there's the high holy, I'll come back to this slide. And there's the high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And oh, by the way, today it's sundown, just a few minutes ago, Yom Kippur has begun for our Jewish community. So it's kind of interesting that this class sort of landed right on Jewish feast day. But so for the pilgrimage festivals, these mark major events in the life of Israel and God's saving action, and part of God showing that he's looking after the community. There are videos for each of these, but just given time issues, I'm not going to go through all of them. But if you'd like a copy of the slides, I can send them to you, and then you can click on the links, or just go to YouTube and just do Judaism 101, and you'll get a whole bunch of things up on the right side. But so Passover is the first one, and I'm not going to dwell on this because we should all be familiar with Passover. Is where the Israelites were told, if you put blood on the outside of the door, then your firstborn are going to be spared. And so that's sort of like, so that's it's kind of Easter. So our Easter is sort of linked to obviously for Passover with the Jewish tradition. So the Seder dinner is the major practice and sort of communal event and family event that's linked to Passover. All right, and then Shavuot, this is one of the other pilgrimage festivals that most people probably don't ever heard of, but you might remember maybe in the New Testament talking about the Feast of Weeks, or that this is the Jewish Pentecost. And so this occurs 50 days after the Passover, when God gave the Ten Commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai. So where Passover, the first pilgrimage festival, is about delivering the Jews from sort of that plague of the Passover, of the firstborn being killed, 50 days later is the giving of the law. So if you think about how that mirrors Christian tradition, right? We sort of have Easter, resurrection, and then Jesus is the Passover lamb, sacrificed for us, right? And then 50 days later, we have the giving of the Holy Spirit, right? So that's kind of a mirror in the Christian tradition, how that mirrors onto sort of Jewish salvation history. And it's celebrated by the end of the spring harvest and the harvest of wheat. So again, that actually matters, because part of the practice of this festival is awareness of offering first fruits, offering back to God, and so forth. And these are pilgrimage festivals because people would actually make pilgrimages, to Jerusalem and so forth. All right, Sukkot, most people haven't heard of this one either. This is actually coming up next week. It's the week-long holiday, 5 days after Yom Kippur, and it basically commemorates Israel being sheltered in the wilderness, right? Because they were in the wilderness 40 years, God providing them shelter. And this is one of the main harvest festivals as well. And so what you'll see, and I don't know if we'll see so much where Jews are such a minority in sort of our community, but in major Jewish communities, people build these little booths. So you hear a Feast of Booths or Feast of Tabernacles, and people will build these in their backyard and so forth, and then eat other meals out there as sort of a witness to how God protected them in the wilderness. So this is the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles. All right. The high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, probably most people have sort of heard about that, those two. So Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year, but it happens like September, sort of early, kind of not in January. And it's a time of spiritual renewal and remembrance of creation. And so 30 days prior, people sort of prepare for that, and they blow the ram's horn. This is sort of a really famous sort of picture to remember that they stand before God, and that they're encouraged to repent. And in some ways, this is, if you think about this as sort of, if you go the 30 days prior plus the 10 days of awe, that's 40 days preparing for Yom Kippur, which is a day of atonement. So in some ways, you can almost look at Rosh Hashanah sort of, it's a loose analogy, sort of like their Lent. It's this time of preparation for Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, right? Where people are required and encouraged to reconcile themselves to one another, to fast, self-denial, to sort of spiritually cleanse themselves, to again, put them in right relationship with God and one another. And then historically, it was the only day that the high priest, the Jewish high priest, could go into the Holy of Holies in the temple when the temple was built. That was a very innermost chamber where the Ark of the Covenant was, and where God was said to dwell. So this was the day that the chief priest could go in. All right, and then Hanukkah. This is not the Jewish Christmas, so don't say that. Hanukkah is called the Feast of Dedication, which is basically a rededication of the Jewish temple in 167 BC. So there was remember the temple was destroyed. The Jews went into exile into the Babylonian captivity. There was the Edict of Cyrus that freed them from captivity, and they went back to Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple. But then, the Jews were always under sort of oppression or people trying to destroy them. And so the temple was under threat again. And this was the time of the Maccabean revolt. So you might remember in the Bible that there's the book of Maccabees, and they sort of warded off this assault on the temple. And when the temple was raided, they took out all the oil, destroyed the temples and so forth. But after the Maccabees won, they went back into the temple, and then they found a jar of oil that hadn't been destroyed. And so they looked at it and thought, well, there's only enough oil to burn for one day. And then they used the oil to light a candle. And instead of only lasting for one day, it lasted for 8 days. And so that's why, so if you look at the menorah here, there's 4 candles on the left, 4 candles on the right. And the center one is the candle that you use to light the other ones with. So it's called the Feast of Lights. It's about the dedication of the temple. And then dreidels and jelly donuts and all these sorts of things are kind of other foods and things associated with the Feast of the Dedication that have kind of happened over time. So we tend to conflate it with, say it's the Jewish Christmas, because Jews also give presents during this time. It also happens usually in the winter time, but it is not the Jewish Christmas. So if you're ever having a conversation with a Jewish friend, try to show them that you know that it's not the Jewish Christmas. Okay. All right. So for this last part of the class, thanks for hanging in there. I know we're kind of going fast, but hopefully this is helpful, at least this kind of the scattershot approach. I want to kind of end with just talking about the major branches of Judaism. So there's traditional Judaism, and then, like I mentioned earlier, they started breaking off after the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th centuries. I don't understand all the distinctions or where the lines of demarcation are actually happening, but we can be a little bit confused because we'll think maybe conservative is like more conservative than Orthodox, but that's actually not necessarily true. And is reform, the reform is probably more liberal and progressive than maybe even Reconstructionist, not sure. So we can be misled, I think, by how these denominations are articulated in our contemporary world, because we might associate with what we understand as like reform in like Protestantism is like Calvinism, which is, more strict than Lutheranism, right? It's a really strict form of Protestantism, but like a Reform Jew is actually pretty liberal and progressive. So Rabbi Looper is actually from the Reform tradition of Judaism. So when you hear Orthodox or conservative or Reform or Constructionist, probably better to ask very specific questions about what their views are towards like women rabbis, what their views are towards interpretation of the law, what their views are with respect to adapting the law to contemporary society, what their views on intermarriage are like, because some of those key questions will, I think, reveal where that particular denomination is kind of on the spectrum. So I'm going to show you this video here, which gives there's 2 videos back to back, and then we'll stop and have time for discussion, hopefully about 15 minutes before we wrap up at 7:30. So we're going to watch this one and then move right on to the next one, because they kind of are back to back.
In the early 1800s in Germany, most big cities had an all-powerful chief rabbi appointed by the government and charged with making Jewish decisions, even acting as a judge in Jewish matters. If you were Jewish, you were supposed to listen to the guy. In each city, there was just one synagogue and one chief rabbi. This didn't sit well with a bunch of Jews influenced by Enlightenment ideas. They wanted to apply scientific study to Judaism, which was known as the Wissenschaft des Judentums. Their main goal was to promote morality rather than a religion mostly based on supernatural claims. A reform of Judaism, if you will. And in modernizing their traditions, they hoped it would prove they could be treated as equal citizens with equal rights, as talked about in the previous video on emancipation. Some of their first changes were in the prayer book. They took out references to Jerusalem being their true home because they felt at home in Germany and weren't dreaming of returning to Jerusalem. They heard sermons in German rather than drashes in Yiddish. They stopped wearing kippahs, added organ music, and had shorter services. Traditional rabbis rejected all of these changes, but eventually in some cities, an event would occur, causing a shift. For instance, in Berlin, the city's synagogue needed renovation, so for a while, Jews gathered in smaller spaces instead. In those smaller groups, these new rulings became popular. In the late 1830s, a young liberal group of rabbis drawn to these reform movements, gathered together by Rabbi Abraham Geiger, began having conferences. It was a small group. These weren't traditional rabbis. In fact, some were so liberal they couldn't get jobs. They started saying what should and shouldn't be done in Judaism. They talked about which rituals they wanted to continue and which didn't have meaning anymore to them. They mostly got rid of the laws that you could put in the category of Judaism is strange because, namely ritual laws whose purposes were not only unclear, they sometimes made it difficult to be a part of German culture. Kosher, for instance, made it impossible for a Jew to eat with a non-Jew. The reformers said the purpose of the religion was to feel holy, to feel spiritual, and to be moral. And a lot of these ritual laws, well, maybe they worked when they were first set up, but they no longer worked that way. And in the 1840s, between the small communities, the conferences, the ideology, it's the start of what we now call a movement. The ideology said that Judaism needs to continue evolving, as humans have always shaped it. They rejected the idea that the Talmud was revelation, oral Torah. It's a human product. Until the Reform movement, there was no such thing as orthodoxy. There was just Judaism. The label orthodoxy emerged as the voice that rejected the Reform movement on behalf of tradition. It said, no, the oral Torah was revealed at Sinai. You can't just reject huge portions of it. You can't deny the authority of the Torah as interpreted by the rabbis, and what you're doing is invalid for that reason. There was a further splinter movement called neo-orthodoxy, what we now call modern orthodoxy, which allowed some very small concessions. For instance, Samson Raphael Hirsch, a leader of that movement, allowed men to shave their beards. Part of the reason modern orthodoxy was so important was that Hirsch said, listen, we're not going to all agree. We're going to have multiple organizations, multiple synagogues. He insisted that the Jewish community of Frankfurt formally split. So whereas before everyone was unified under one official way of being Jewish, and there were these little, pop-up shops of other ways of being Jewish, Hirsch is the one who said, I'm tired of fighting. You go do your thing, and I'll do my thing. We don't even want to talk to you. Go do something separate. It was a really important transition, and it's a piece of beginning to think about distinct movements in Judaism, rather than everyone arguing about the one way all Jews should be Jewish in the modern world. Another critic of reform, Zachariah Frankel, split from the reformers over whether to pray in German instead of Hebrew. Was it more important for people to understand what they were saying, or for people to pray in the same way their grandparents prayed? He accepted the scientific study of Judaism, but remained committed to tradition. He went on to form what ultimately became conservative Judaism. He formed the Jewish Theological Seminary of Breslau, which inspired the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, which became the heart of the conservative movement as we know it today. By the second half of the 19th century, the liberal Jewish movement in Germany was by far the majority. Around this time, more and more Jews started moving to America, And there, the reform and conservative movements reached new heights. So how did Judaism spread in America? Well, that's a story for another time.
All right. So I hope when you were kind of watching that video, you were thinking about how the Christian tradition went through some of those same things, right? What do we do about scripture? Should it be in, what language should it be in? How should we pray? Who's in charge? Who gets to make a decision? Is it sacred, or can we apply scientific methods to it, etc.? So that's all a product of bigger intellectual movements that was happening in Europe during the Enlightenment. And so this next video sort of goes into that a little bit more in depth.
If you want to understand how Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Judaism, modern Judaism today came to be, you need to take a step back to when they first formed. And to understand two movements that are both a little bit of a mouthful that kind of formed Western civilization as we know it today. One was intellectual and one was political. Enlightenment and emancipation. So the Enlightenment was this idea that we have the ability to use logic and discover truth on our own, as opposed to just trusting the church on what we're supposed to believe. In the 18th century, this was a revolutionary idea, like literally revolutionary. If the Protestant Reformation, which many say is the seat of the Enlightenment, sought to overthrow the Catholic Church's control of truth, the Enlightenment sought to overthrow the authority of religious leaders in general. The history here normally focuses on the French Enlightenment, as it was very important to the English and to the founders of America. But the Enlightenment in Germany, which was happening at the same time, was important to the Jews as it was more friendly to religion, or rather, what I would say, rational religion. God linked with the idea of morality and ethics. So Moses Mendelssohn, the star of our story, came to Berlin in the 1700s and became one of the figures of the Enlightenment. He was a socialite with other philosophers as well as an observant Jew. He gained broad respect through writing about the Enlightenment, and he used that respect to strongly advocate for Jewish emancipation, which is the other movement. It was a political and social one. It meant Jews gaining civic rights and becoming German citizens. Up until that point, Jews had a corporate status, so they interacted with the authorities as a group rather than as individuals. They paid for their taxes as a group. They'd only go to German courts if a matter couldn't be resolved in a Jewish one. Emancipation meant Jews being able to live where they wanted. It meant getting access to many more jobs through being able to join the guilds. It meant being able to go to a bunch more schools. So the hope was with emancipation, everything would be open. It was kind of a big deal. There was an ongoing debate in Germany over whether the Jews should be emancipated. Even though Jews had been there for centuries, they were viewed as outsiders because they had their own culture. They had their own laws, their own language, Yiddish. Before emancipation could happen, many Germans wanted Jews to have a better knowledge of German culture in general, its literature, its values, its language. So in an effort to teach Jews German, and in that way help encourage Germans to support emancipation, Mendelssohn translated the Bible into German using Hebrew characters. You could call it a transliteration. Jews could read a familiar text in a language they were less familiar with. It was like watching a movie you know really well in English in another language. You just get better at it. So it was accompanied by a commentary, the Biur, which was written by Mendelssohn's students who oversaw the project. The Biur was trying to bring Enlightenment ideals into alignment with other Jewish commentary. The word for the Jewish Enlightenment is the Haskalah, and the Biur is what kicked it off. So the Biur was the early project on which a lot of his students cut their teeth. It got a strong reaction. Some people denounced it, others wondered what the point was, most ignored it. What's important is that it helped spark the Haskalah movement. Even more than the book itself, the creation of the book, this collection of his students working on the project, created a movement. And while in Germany, the Haskalah only went so far, its influence continued to spread. And by the time it reached Eastern Europe, it had a huge impact. Emancipation took time. Government rulings are complicated. Napoleon was great for the Jews. Well, it was good for the Jews. Napoleon was good for the Jews. His departure was less good. My God, that's a simplification. But by 1871, with the establishment of the modern German state, the Jews were formally emancipated. It remains that way until they lost their rights under the Nazis. Enlightenment, a new way to think, and emancipation, Jewish civic rights and economic opportunities, meant that the world had changed. It was now inevitable that the religious aspects of Judaism would change too. And it did. Reform, conservative, and in a way, Orthodox Judaism grew out of this. And to learn about the birth of the Jewish movement as we know them today, click.
All right. I think that's a really important video. I think, again, because I think sometimes when we think about religious traditions and especially ones we're not familiar with, we tend to think of them as sort of static. But how Judaism changed and developed, especially during that period with respect to the Enlightenment, and then this idea of emancipation is huge, right? So if you think about the Jews kind of existed in their own closed communities. Like the video was saying, they had their own language, they had their own culture, they had their own courts. They didn't have, standing as individual citizens, so they went to their own schools, et cetera. So they, they were sort of foreigners in lots of ways in this country. But, as sort of, the Enlightenment and all the revolutions were happening in which democracy was starting to be born and the rights of citizens and so forth, and they're living in the midst of that. And so you could see why that would be attractive to be able to participate in the wider political society, more job opportunities, the guilds, go to different schools, then you could be part of government. Now you could be part of the government in which has some say, under which you're living under, and so forth. And so it just radically changed the whole landscape of how Jews understood themselves and sort of lived in community. And so this is a very different experience than Christians had, right? Because the Christian West, basically since Constantine, 325, in Europe was the majority religion. So with sort of the Enlightenment and sort of, the rise of democracies, while that impacted, right, the authority structure of the church, right, and popes and bishops and the relationship to the state and sort of who had, the rights to do whatever. So the Enlightenment and sort of democracy impacted the Christian church. It was in a very different way. That was more an issue of church-state relations and sharing of power. Who could appoint bishops, who could appoint kings, should we even have kings, etc. Where if you're a religious minority in a predominantly Christian environment, the way the Enlightenment and sort of the rise of democracy and individual rights happens, you can see why it had such a dramatic change on sort of how modern Judaism, which is conservative, Orthodox, Reform, etc., happened. And then if more of the liberal, in context here, the Jewish tradition after the Enlightenment start immigrating to America, right? So it's not surprising that sort of Reconstructionists and some of the more liberal movements of Judaism kind of take hold in America. But then when you have sort of persecution of Jews, especially after World War II, so it's interesting, they were, I think, emancipated in 1871 and then lost their rights in 1935. So that's only 60 years. So that could be within the lifetime of one person, right? So you're emancipated, have all these new opportunities within Germany, and then 60 years later, you lose all that under German National Socialism and the Third Reich. And so then after all that, now you have all these immigrants sort of then moving to America and, other countries. And once again, finding themselves as a religious minority, sort of, et cetera. So a lot of interplay between Jewish identity, self-understanding, practices within Judaism, and how that relates to the changes and dynamics of the politics and culture sort of going on at the same time. All right. So I'm not going to talk about Kabbalah, which is like a mystical form of Judaism. So Judaism also has a sort of mystical side, this contemplative side. So I urge you to sort of, Google that or go check out a video. So it's also interesting to have that aspect of Judaism as well. All right. So this is Rabbi Scott Looper, who's going to be our speaker on Wednesday, the 6th of October. And this is just a little, so that's his picture, and then a little bit about his philosophy as being a rabbi and his vision. So I think it's interesting. He talks about his vision of Judaism as a relational religion. Look, that sentence, second sentence, ever in conversation with itself. So it's always, and in extension with the larger community. And the second sentence, I endeavor to understand Judaism through the lens of intellectual curiosity, to do the same. So again, he's within the Reform tradition, there's a sense of the dynamic and ever evolving aspect of Judaism being in conversation with itself, but also within wider society. So, all right. I'm going to stop there and then stop sharing my screen and then see all your happy faces. You're all still there. I'm amazed. Sorry for the, thanks for hanging in there with kind of this, kind of bulldoze through Judaism, but we've got about 10 minutes left. And so I'd like to hear some of your thoughts, your reactions. Come on up on the screen if you want to be seen in whatever state you're in at 7:20 in the evening. And so yeah, I'd just like to hear your reactions. What sort of struck out to you? Anything that was sort of new, things that made you think about anything differently, and or questions for the rabbi. So it's sort of open, just leave it open to anyone. So
Well, I have a question for the rabbi.
all right, Arthur.
How often in his life as a rabbi do people from his congregation come to him with questions about what we've been learning tonight? What is correct? What is orthodox? What is allowed? That sort of thing. How often, say, in a month, do people come with questions like that? He had a editorial, an opinion piece in the Montgomery Advertiser last month on what we used to call cross-dressing, which is forbidden somewhere in the law in the Old Testament. And he dealt with that and said that times have changed and we should modify how we look on that sort of thing. But that would be what I would be interested in hearing him say.
Okay, so basically kind of what's his role as interpreter of the law for his congregation, right?
Yes. How often
Okay.
does
That's a great one. Who else? I'll call on you. JC and Melissa.
Deonna, I'm kind of curious what the role of, whatever the right term is in Judaism, non-ordained people. So we know there's a rabbi there at the synagogue, but what role do other people then in the group play?
So kind of what's their equivalent of like lay ministry or lay leadership, and what are the rules around that? Okay. That's a good question. All right. Well, Jimmy, you don't even have to have a question, but even just general reflections.
Okay. I want to go back to what you said originally. I would like to hear from the rabbi briefly, sort of his development in the Jewish religion to the point at which he became a rabbi. I don't know how that happens in their world. So, where he came from and how he developed there. You don't have to spend the whole time on his life story, but that is very interesting to me. And as he is a relational person, he would be, I think, very interested in talking about that. with respect to this class, this has been very interesting to me. I've never really considered the Jewish faith to be as dynamic as it was presented tonight. So many facets and so many progressions, so many differences, and how it is adapted and changed over time. I've always just thought, okay, Jews, and then my mind goes back to the beginning of time.
Right.
Well, that's how they think of us too, but
Right.
that is very, very interesting. And I want to see this recording and go back and go through this class again. So those videos were very instructive.
I'm glad you enjoyed the videos. I'm sorry I didn't have time to show you all of them. But if you want the PowerPoint, the links are embedded and you can go through, because some of the videos that walk through the different festivals and kind of what, the giving of the law, but how that's actually commemorated and celebrated in the different practices. And there's so many different ways that people celebrate the remembrance of the law. It's like really fascinating. So even the way people experience and express those particular festivals is also very wide ranging.
Yeah, their expression of ritual and the value associated with that, very valuable, kind of instructive for us too. So
Yeah.
I'll do that.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
And I have a question. Ms.
Yes,
John,
John.
so in the Christian religion, the motivation, it seems the main motivation for ultimate motivation for us doing what we're supposed to do is eternal life.
Uh-huh.
So what's their motivation for doing what they're supposed to do in the Jewish side of things? I'd like to hear what he says about that.
Okay. Yeah. So like, what's the end state, right? So is it the restoration of Jerusalem, right? Zion returning to the promised land is the fulfilling of the covenant, which is this worldly thing. Or is there a more sort of spiritual aspect to it? So that's a really good question.
Right.
So I'll write that one down too. So that's good.
Is there a requirement for something akin to a confirmation class before a Jewish boy or girl is mitzvah?
Yes. Yeah, I'm pretty sure there is, but we can ask him like what that entails, right? What what does their curriculum look like, right? Because if somebody said, what's the confirmation curriculum look like, we could tell them. So what is it for them? There's also another interesting video, or it was not in the series, but another one I watched where a guy never went through the formal bar mitzvah ceremony, but he wanted to get married as, in a Jewish wedding ceremony. And he felt really ashamed to tell the rabbi that he had never had the bar mitzvah ceremony. And the rabbi's response to him was, when you turned 13, you became sort of a man of the commandment. It happens. And then the ceremony just marks that occasion. It's not necessarily anything that you have to do to earn it or qualify for it. And he said it made him feel better that it's just when you become 13, it's like how we reach the age of majority at 18, right? It's just this day happens and you can vote and you're held responsible as an adult and for the law, right? You don't have to do anything, to be recognized to reach the age of majority. So in some ways, the bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah is a recognition that they're the age of the majority in their tradition. But that's a good question of what sort of education do they take to prep young people for that.
Deonna, I'd be interested in knowing what happens when they die. I know there's something that you're supposed to, I think it's called sit Shiva or something for a number of days.
Mm-hmm.
What's the function of that? And a Jewish funeral I went to years ago was one of the most moving things I've ever done. The last prayer is something that I could feel the breeze and the tents and the sands. I mean, I was back 2,000 years. Are they, instead of going to be with Jesus, are they reconnected somehow with Abraham and what came before? Or, I mean, how is their death? Is it just the end of everything, or do they have something?
Yeah, it's a good question. Sort of end of life. Is there a life after death? what do they think about the afterlife questions? Okay.
Nice.
Done. Got it. Awesome.
I have a question.
Yes, George.
Oh, I wonder how the rabbi feels what it's like living in Montgomery in this very conservative society. What are the anti-Semitism challenges?
Mhm.
And while this state in general is a very conservative state, the country at large, of course, is greatly polarized. And so I am interested in, as I say, what it is like living in a very conservative society. And the last thing I would like to say, if you don't mind my saying, you are quite the scholar.
Thanks. Well,
think
I don't
that-
know about that, but
I think there would be unanimity of that particular point. But
thanks.
thank you very much.
Yeah.
You're welcome. I express great appreciation to Bim Bam, who made all those instructional videos, which are really good, because sometimes trying to actually find some that are good and well thought out, right, that are serious enough, but at the right level, that's hard, because sometimes you find stuff and it's just, I'm like, yeah, that's not helpful. So I was really happy to find that series. So that way I didn't have to talk the whole time.
I'd like to ask the question,
Kitty.
are they suffering the same losing in their congregation that, say, Christianity is, our churches are? The older people seem to be dying, the ones that were kind of kept things together, and does the young, how are they handling that?
No, that's a good question, right? So are they experiencing the same forces of modernity, right, that keep pressing in on making it harder to either, live out one's faith in a secular society when there's all these, pressures like soccer, or do they have to, they have to compete with soccer the same way we do? So yeah, that's a good question.
Deonna, one other thing
Reggie.
that I would be interested in is, I've always heard that you inherit your Judaism through your mother. And one of the things that Jewish friends of mine in Montgomery have said recently is that the intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles, particularly in Montgomery, is one of the reasons that there seems to be a diminution in the size of some of the congregations. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I had always heard that you weren't a Jew unless your mother was a Jew.
Yeah, so that's a question. So there's two aspects to that I'm hearing. One is it true that intermarriage might be contributing to a drop off in religious participation and identity of Jews? That's the first question I'm hearing. And then what was the last part that you said? I lost my train of thought.
The biological fact of that you aren't Jewish unless your mother was Jewish.
Right. So then there's a question about, what does converting to Judaism look like? Right. And so there's right, because Jews don't tend to proselytize. That's just not, we've got the go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every nation. Right. And that's, because what is distinctive about Christianity is it's not an inherited thing, right? It's something that you make a commitment to, and it's open to Jews, Gentiles, whoever, right? So converting is the main way most people come to Christianity, especially in the early church, right? It was people converted to Christianity. But in Judaism, the idea of converting to Judaism, that's just not a thing. So in the past, so what does that look like now? And be interesting also to know who tends to convert to Judaism, and what is it about the practice of Judaism that, especially Christian converts to Judaism, it might be interesting to hear what that's like, or what converts they have, who is coming to them. Is it just people with no religious background, or are they getting Protestants, Catholics, evangelicals, coming into the synagogue? So that's a good question. What else?
I actually was wondering how they feel the Christian attitude is toward them in Montgomery.
Okay, so that's
would
sort of
they want-
related to George's question.
Yeah, would they want more interaction, or like we go to their food festival in the fall, and our friends that are there seem to appreciate that. You know, how helpful would it be to encourage that kind of thing?
No, on that, when I was a child and Beth Orr was downtown, St. John's and Beth Orr were very closely related. Our EYCs worked together all the time. Our choir sang for their services. We were very closely interacting then, and then I guess just location broke a lot of that.
That's helpful to know, Marnie. I didn't know about kind of the historical connection, kind of like this historical connection. We have the Greek Orthodox Church here too. One of the things that at the end of the course, sometime in November, or December, is, you know, us going to maybe a Friday night service at Temple Beth Orr, and going to, it's hard for us to go to the Greek Orthodox service on Sunday, unless John lets me be gone one day, we could go. But they do have a Saturday evening, like Vesper service we could go to, and they may be making a pilgrimage over to the Islamic Center of Montgomery just to kind of see what it's like. So that was also one of my thoughts, is we'll do the education, we'll have the speakers, and then for people that are interested, we will try to figure out a way to go visit the congregations of the people who've come to speak, maybe go to a service, or at least just kind of go in and sort of see the actual places. So, but thanks for that info, Marnie, about the.
It'd be interesting if they even wanted us there. I mean, they might.
Well, the Greek Orthodox do. I've already checked
No,
that.
I mean-
I mentioned it to the rabbi, and he said that would be fine.
Oh, okay.
Well, following up on what Marnie said, when the Church of the Ascension burned to the ground, the first service was held at Beth Orr after David Bailison came to Mark Waldo, and there's been a very close relationship as a result of that, including having Seder demos every year for as long as I've been aware of it.
Right. No, that's great. That's really helpful to know. That's awesome. You know, maybe that's something I can compile, or we can talk about, because I think when the speaker comes, when Rabbi Luber comes, it would be helpful to share that with the wider group, saying, you know, here's kind of the connections and the way the congregations, you know, have connected in the past and so forth. So yeah, that's awesome.
You know, there's a really good book out about the history of the Jewish community in Montgomery from the beginning of time. And I just Google it, you'll find it. I think the author's name is Mary Blanton. I could be wrong about that. It is very, very interesting.
Do you remember the title, Jimmy?
I can't, but I'll share it with y'all. I've got it in my bookcase. I've read it twice. Really a great history right up to recently.
Oh, this report.
Yeah, that's helpful. Awesome. Thank you. What else? I'm mindful of the time. I don't want to keep people too long, but I'm also, you know, happy to stay and answer questions, or if people have anything to say that they haven't had a chance to ask.
Are the two Jewish churches in synagogues in Montgomery have the same thoughts in religion? What are the differences of what are their differences? Is it just a difference in the congregations, or is there, do they have any different beliefs? They seem to be very separate.
Right. So are they both Reform synagogues, or is one conservative, or is one Reconstructionist, or is one something like that? So that might also be an interesting question to ask him too, is like, what's his relationship with the other rabbis and sort of Jewish congregations in Montgomery? Yeah, it's good. What else? Anybody? Other questions? All right. Well, if you come up with any questions, feel free to email them to me.
We're not unmuted.
Unmuted.
Yeah.
One of the things that I remember when Agudath Israel and Itzhak Aim combined, it was because both of their congregations had diminished to such a level, but they were a Jewish faith that had a Spanish heritage, is my understanding. And
Okay.
they were much more conservative than, or much more orthodox than was Bethel.
Yeah, Bethel's always been more the German Jews, and the others were the Sephardic.
Right.
But I think they've merged pretty much. I don't know.
Agudath and Itzhak Aim
Yeah.
were merged. They
Yeah,
did
so I
merge.
mean, that's interesting, because like we think Episcopal congregations, you're just Episcopalians kind of coming together. Maybe you've got Anglo, higher church and lower church and broad church, but that's a whole different dynamic, right? If you're having, because Jews are religious minorities, right? And if they're coming from kind of the different sort of ethnic or traditions.
That was the word I was looking for.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's like the Orthodox Church has similar issues, right? Because there's Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, right? There's a Russian Orthodox community here. There's a Greek Orthodox community here, but they're not in communion with each other. And so they don't talk to each other, right? But both congregations are really small, but trying to combine them would be really difficult. So yeah. So that's like a whole, it's almost like, how do you merge like a Catholic and an Episcopal church and an evangelical church onto one? What would that look like? So yeah, so very different dynamics. So yeah, that's a good question. What else?
The Pope would be sitting on the fence.
Maybe. Yeah, who knows, right? I mean, be interesting. All right, any other questions? All right, well, again, if you think of anything, email me, let me know. Or if you're remembering on our next, bring it up at the beginning of our next lesson. So next time we're going to talk about Greek Christian Orthodoxy in general. And I'm going to focus probably a little bit more on the history there and kind of where the issues are between the Eastern and like how the Eastern-Western split happened, where there's some major differences theologically and in spiritual practices. And then kind of what the current expression of Orthodoxy is with all the different, Russian, Serbian, etc. So I don't know how many fun videos I might find. I don't know if I will. I'll try to look for some. And then I may ask Paul Lundberg, Father Paul Lundberg. He's the local Orthodox priest. Maybe he'll join us for the Zoom conversation if he's free. So it'd be helpful to have him, along, and we can ask him questions as we're going along. But the bishop is the one who's coming on that Tuesday, the 26th. So, all right, well, let's just close. I'll just close with Psalm 134. Seems only fitting to read one of the Psalms, and this is one of the Psalms in the Compline service. So Psalm 134. Behold now, bless the Lord, all you servants of the Lord, you that stand by night in the house of the Lord. Lift up your hands in the holy place and bless the Lord. The Lord who made heaven and earth bless you out of Zion. Amen.
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 Thank you.
All right.